Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Tuesday sew along. Today, we're going to be working on block number 31 called Delft Mill. We'll be talking about that in a minute. But beforehand, I wanted to share with you some new fabrics that have come in. We like to share what comes in because it's always exciting to see what all comes in. Some of it I have everything that's come in so far is already on the shelves and in our system, so you can see it. But first of all, I'd like to show you, this is a fat quarter tower. It's Tula's new Everglow line. And there's a couple of colors of giraffes, a couple of colors of elephants, and then there's a lot of basics, stripes, dots, assorted, even little hummingbirds or some kind of little animal on basic colors that are coordinates. There's blues and greens and lime and a bright orange. Doesn't look real bright in the picture on the screen, but trust me, it's very bright. So almost neon in some cases, but it's kind of a fun group. And this is called Everglow. That's her newest line that just came out. Another group that we got recently is this Wild Blossoms. We have a couple of different things in yardage for coordinates. And then when I get them in, I roll them so you can see the assorted colors, because generally when you look at a layer cake, you just see whatever's on top, but there's some deep, lush greens, some bright oranges, some warm reds, some purples, some blues, some really nice coordinating pieces in that group. So this is Wild Blossoms. It's from Moda, designed by Pickets. I'm just tossing them away. So it's not too early to think about Halloween. This is called the Boo Crew, and it's got fun greens. This is a very bright lime green, and in my screen it doesn't look all that bright. And there's some jack-o'-lanterns, some bats, some spider webs, and some fun little whimsical Halloween. It's called the Boo Crew. This one is called Sundance. It's got some beautiful sunflower prints and some mint green, some nice golds, some blues, and some darker blues, and lots of sunflowers as well. So Sundance, that's another group that has come in. And this one's called Autumn Light. This one just came in yesterday, maybe. We've got it on the shelf today. But it's full of really warm fall colors. It's got a beautiful print that has words on it, kind of tossed words. And we have several colors of that on the shelf in yardage, as well as what's in the layer cake. And we also got strips of that one. This one is 42.5-inch strips. So if you like to do jelly roll type things, this would take care of that because it's got 40 strips. Some of the things there's a pair of color strips, and some of them there's just a single strip. So those are some of the new things that have come in. We have a bunch of stuff we're still waiting on. So those are available. Pre-cuts generally I don't put on our website. So if you're not local and you're interested in some of the pre-cuts, if you'll give us a call, we can set you up and ship it to you. But we often have enough foot traffic that we just don't usually put all of the pre-cuts on our website. So that is something you can think about. So for today, we're going to be doing Delft Mill. So let's talk about this block for a minute. First of all, it is constructed with some techniques that use some of Deb's tools. This is a Picket and Quicket technique, and we're going to do that one first, and then we'll come back to this technique that is called Bird of Paradise, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, the Picket and Quicket technique sheet, and by the way, we have all of the technique sheets if you need them. These ship really easily in an envelope. It gives sizing information. It gives construction information. It gives good pictures of how to trim And all of that information is on the technique sheet. And it's laminated, so it's coffee proof, so you can sit down and follow through the directions. The Pickets and Quickets, it shows up on the top corner that is a wing clipper technique, and that's what I'm going to be using. Pickets and Quickets, there's a couple of different ways you can make them and get to the point that you're ready to trim. I'm going to show you the Pickets, that's the option 1, and I want to show you, first of all, wrong camera, you're going to be doing the Picket fence. You want to make sure that you line up the seam so it goes the way you want it to go in order for it to make that pinwheel. I'm going to call it a large pinwheel, the way this looks with the light blue. Those connect and make a big pinwheel. So you want to make sure that this picket leans the correct way for this block. You can do this particular technique either direction and it would work to do that. So here's how you would do that. We've got our rectangle, and your instructions tell you how big those rectangles need to be. You're going to have squares. Now the square is going to be the same width, same as the width of your rectangle. And you're going to do kind of a basic folded corner technique where you're going to lay your square on one end of your rectangle. You're going to make a seam across there, and you're going to flip and trim away. Then you're going to trim the whole thing to the right size. That being said, if you don't pay attention to which way you put that seam on there, you could end up with a picket like that. And in some projects, that would be fine, and it would work just fine. In this project, you want it to lean this way. So you want to make sure that you sew in that direction. So we're going to go over to the sewing area, and I'll get set up so I can show you how that actually looks. So we've got several people that are saying hello. We're glad to have everybody here. Today, Tony is gone, so I'll try to keep track of any comments or questions that people make. Now, when you are using this square for drawing your line on, you only need one line because we're just going to stitch across the square corner to corner. So I am not worrying about lining up my etched line point to point the way I would normally do if I was drawing a line on both sides. I don't need that for this. I just need one line. So I'm just going to draw a diagonal line, and whatever marking tool works for you. I've told you before, and it's been a while since we've talked about that, but I like a permanent gel pen. They slide real easily. You could use a pencil, which would work fine. You could even use a friction pen that disappears with heat. The only thing is if you use a friction pen and then for some reason you iron your piece before you stitch it, your mark disappears. So I do mark as lightly as I can get by with and still be able to see my mark. So I'm going to check this, and you're probably going to want to check this with your diagram. As I'm looking at this, if I stitch this direction, it's not going to turn out the way I want it to. So you want to make sure that you have your seam going the right direction. So I've got it checked, and that's the way I want it to go. So I'm just going to stitch right along that line. And you just need 4 of those. There's a couple of different ways you can make a Quicket. That involves making a similar way that you would use when you're making flying geese. This is kind of like a flying goose with one wing, one sky part. And so that is why the wing clipper tool is the tool we're going to use to trim it. But that way, that's why you want to do the seams the way that you want them to lay, and check that before you stitch it. Then I'm putting right sides together. I didn't really talk about that, but I'm putting right sides together on my rectangle. I realize now that I didn't have my camera exactly where it should have been, but now you should be able to see better. And I've got one more, and we're going to line that up. And if you don't have one already stitched the way I do for a reference, be sure and look at your picture so that they'll lean the way you want them to. All of these are stitched the same direction. And once stitched, then I'm just going to park my needle and cut them apart, and then I'm ready to go to the ironing and cutting surface, and we'll finish these up. They don't take very long, but they're a quick, snazzy little unit you can put in your project. So let's go to the overhead camera so you can see what I'm going to do. So first of all, before I cut anything, you can do this one of two ways. I can go ahead and trim away the part that I don't need. In this case, I can just lay a ruler along that seam and cut and leave myself a 1/4 inch. I could also press it before I trim away. I just find it just as easy to do it this way. You could do this with scissors as well, but I'm just laying my edge of my wing clipper there. And actually, if I flipped it around, you can see that there's a 1/4 inch line on this side of your wing clipper tool that you can line up on that seam. I was just eyeballing these, so they're pretty close, but they may not be exact. So now I'm ready to press these. Let me get this out of my way because we know this one's already right. And my iron was hot a minute ago, so I'm going to assume it's still hot. We're just going to give it a finger press. Finger pressing your seam before you set your iron on it will help you be more successful because that gets your seam allowance going the way you need it to go without having to spend so much time making sure that it's going the right way. Once I get them finger pressed, I just set the iron on it. Notice I got them all finger pressed, set the iron on all 4 of them at the same time. And I'm often doing that because that kind of gets me set up and going the way I want to, and I can overlap even the acorn pressing solution so that that gets them all going the way I want them to. Now I'm ready to trim, and this is a 3 by 6 inch unit. Let me move a few things out of my way so you can see what I'm doing. Put that over there. So you're going to place this on your cutting surface as if it was a flying goose that had the 2 seams that form a V. So you want that pointing toward you. If you're right-handed, this is the direction you put it. If you're left-handed, you're simply going to pretend that you have those 2 seams pointing to the right. And then you place your tool vertically like this. Since I am not left-handed, I'm going to put it this way. So my size that I need to trim this to is 3.5 by 6.5. So there's my 3.5, there's my 6.5, and there's the line that I need to line up on my diagonal seam. And I just want to make sure there's just a sliver all the way around that 3.5 by 6.5 inch rectangle. I'm going to cut up and over. I'm going to turn 180 degrees. Now this time the 6.5 by 3.5 inch lines are going to line up on my cut edges. And I should have a diagonal line here connected to this bold X at the top so that it makes sure that the seam lines up where I need it to. And I'm just going to do that with all 4 pieces. You're going to point the V towards you, line up the 6.5 inch line and 3.5 inch line, and the diagonal line that's connected to the 6.5, cut up and across. And you're not going to have a lot to trim away, but that is a way that you can get these prepared. Now, I didn't really talk about this, so I'm going to go backwards and talk. And you would do these other 2 pieces the same way. Now, if you want to, I'm going to pretend I haven't cut this away. So there's what I trimmed away. Let me go back to here and just press that seam out of it so it'll lay down so you can understand what I'm saying. So Before you trim away this part, I'm not going to need this part for my project, but this could make another half square for some other project or for an extra block in this project. And one way you can do that, instead of drawing just a single line down the center, I could actually take my magic wand, line it up point to point, and put a line right on the point to point and another line on the other side of the magic wand. Then I could stitch right on both lines, and that would give me a half square here that I could use for some other project. So that is a way that you can utilize these triangles that you're going to trim away. You're not going to need that for this block, but you could use them for something else. Other than that, if you like to work with mini or small pieces, you could just save these, put them in a basket, and they could be a crumb quilt or some other project. So that is an option for you. So that's how you're going to make all of these picket units, and then you're going to trim them. I'll trim the others later because I want to go on to our bird of paradise unit. So here's what the unit looks like so that it creates that double pinwheel sort of a look. You have a blue pinwheel, you have a pale blue pinwheel, and then you have a bright square right in the middle of that. This is also a technique sheet, and I want to talk about this a little bit, and I'll show you a couple of options. This lists the large square squared as the tool. You need to have it upside down. So it lists the large square squared. It has a 4-star difficulty level indicator. Don't let that scare you. If you want to make this, just follow the instructions step by step, and it gives you a chart that explains what you cut for the different parts of the bird of paradise unit. I'm going to put this over here, and let's talk about how you know. First of all, a bird of paradise unit is a rectangle, just like the flying goose rectangle, but it's made kind of in a little different process. So it actually has a goose shape here, but I'm starting with a square. There are other options for what I could put here. Anything that is a square. I could put a half square there. I could put a shaded 4 patch there. Of course, it has to fit within the shape of the square in my 3x6 finished unit. So that means that from point to point, this needs to measure 3 inches, just like I would need if I was making a square squared unit that finishes 3-inch square. Now I'm not doing a square. I'm actually going to put this inside of a rectangle, but I can use my square squared tool to get to that point, and I'll explain how I do that. So one thing I want to do is make sure that whatever I'm putting here, and in this particular block it's a whole square, I need to use my square squared tool to cut these to the right size. So I have actually got a stack of squares. I actually have 4 of them here. And on my tool, on the A part, remember we've talked about this before, if you're using the large square squared, I'm digging over in my box right now so I can kind of show you what I'm talking about. Because you can do this with your large square squared, and it is marked part A here on the part where you cut the center square for your square squared. And then there's a part B that you use to trim up your units. You can do this unit, the 3x6 unit, with the large square squared, but you can also do this particular size and anything smaller with the original square squared tool. So that's what I'm using just in the interest of space. If you have the large square squared, you can try this technique with it. If you have the smaller one, you have what you need to make this size. So you'll be fine with that. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the A section, and I'm going to find the center square for 3-inch blocks. And it even tells me to cut that from a 2 3/4 inch strip. Now I'm actually cutting that from squares, because I can square that up just using squares. And I'm going to cut all 4 of them at the same time. And just so I know that they're nice and square, I'm going to just trim a bit off of all 4 sides. So I'm going to trim off of 2 sides, turn 180 degrees, and then I'll line up the center square for 3-inch finished blocks on the lines, and I'll cut up and across. So there's my center square for my bird of paradise. Now looking at this, if I'm going to fold this in half so you can see that actually the construction, ignoring the square, the construction of this particular part is a quarter square here, because if I took a square of blue, I would be able to cut it in 4 pieces, a half square of the pale blue, because I could cut 1 square into 2 pieces and make this piece. This is so that the bias is in the correct places. I don't want to end up with bias on the outside edges of my unit. So it's constructed with a couple of triangles that are actually a quarter square triangle and a couple of triangles that are a half square triangle. So in order to have enough triangles to make my bird of paradise units for this particular block, I have a couple of dark blue squares. That's what's going to go on this side that is from quarter squares. And I'm just going to lay them face to face or back to back. This part doesn't matter because I'm going to cut twice. I'm going to cut corner to corner, and I'll show you. Without picking up my fabric, I'm going to turn whatever my cutting guide is, and I'm going to cut point to point the other way. That gives me 4 quarter squares from each of the squares I started with. So I actually have 8 of them. Now you want to handle them with care, treat them with respect, because all of these sides here are biased. All of the outside are straight of the grain. But I still want to be careful with them, so I'm just going to carefully stack them on top of my center square. Now for this triangle and this triangle, I need squares that are half squares. So I'm just going to, I don't need those right now. I've got a couple of blue squares and a couple of background squares, and I'm just going to lay them on top of each other, grab a tool I can cut against, and cut point to point. All of the triangles in this case are cut oversized. The square is cut to the exact size that you're going to need. But there's a triangle for this side. There's triangles for this side. There's triangles, because I'm going to be making 4 of these. There's my triangles for this side. So that's how it's all going to go together. That's what I'm going to be putting together. So I'm going to take this whole stack, and just because I laid them on top of my ruler, I can pick up the whole ruler and carry it over to the sewing area just to kind of keep it all together and lined up. So I see a lot of people that have signed on since I first started talking and went over to the other camera. So I brought the original Bird of Paradise unit, I can't even say that, over here so you can see how they all go together. So that is how my unit goes together. I guess it would help if I'd move the camera. So there is my center. I need 2 of my dark blue triangles and a light blue and a background triangle. So when I'm doing this, if I want my layout to look like the layout in the picture, I want to make sure that this one goes on, this background triangle goes on this side, and this pale blue triangle ends up on this side. Otherwise, it will still make a Bird of Paradise unit, but it won't make that double pinwheel. So you do want to be careful with your color placement. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab my center square, and I'm going to stitch I'm going to turn it around this way because I think it'll be easier for you to see how I pick this up. I'm going to pick up a triangle and my center square, and I'm going to flip it over. I want to sew with the square on top and the triangle on bottom. The triangle is going to get trimmed, but the square is not. It is already to size. So I'm going to stitch along the side here. And then I'm going to move the camera back over there so you can see me pick that same combination up again. I'm going to always stitch my square to this triangle. And if I pick up my square and flip it over and then pick it up to straighten up the alignment, I'm much more likely to get the right side sewn on. Because it's possible to sew it on this side and then it's going to give you some issues when you try to sew the other one on. So if you get yourself kind of in a routine where you sew your Bird of Paradise units the same every time, you'll have a whole lot better success. So I am using my patchwork foot and I'm guiding from the square. I'm going to grab another one. And I want it to be the same orientation as the one I just fed through. So I'm going to line up my corners. That ear is sticking out at the bottom, and I'm using the square as my guide. The triangle's going to get trimmed, but the square is not. And I'm going to do the last one. The triangle is sticking out at the bottom. The square is going to go right on top, and I'm going to align those corners so that it is lined up. Now, I will tell you, for making 4 Bird of Paradise units, I don't get up and press them until I have all 4 triangles added back. You could, if I'm doing 50 of these, I might. But for this particular, these 4 units, I generally don't get up and take those to the iron. Now I'm going to be pressing toward the triangle. And I'm just going to finger press it. You can't add the next triangle till you press this one back. And when I get ready to add this triangle, I need to make sure it looks like a mountain. I have my square, whatever your square is, whether it's a shaded 4 patch or a half square, it has to be on the top. And then this triangle ends up aligned that way. I still want to stitch with the square on top. So I'm going to place that on here, and then I'm going to turn it upside down so that my ear is going through the needle first. I am still lining up with my square, because it's a little bit oversized. It's going to get trimmed. So every time I add another triangle, I'm going to start by finger pressing. I want this to line up so that all of them end up oriented the same way, and I'm going to line up the corners. And you'll kind of get your own rhythm for how you feed these through and make sure that they're on the correct side of that center square. Sometimes if you're making one with a shaded 4 patch or a half square in the center, that may make it a little easier to figure out which side this triangle needs to go on. But in this case, I'm just adding them. We're going to flip that over because I need for this to go through this way. Once you get it placed, you might want to check and make sure you're stitching the right way, because that's what I want it to look like when I get it stitched. But I like to sew with the square on top, because that way I can make sure that I am going to end up with the right size unit and the seams aligned where they're supposed to. And even though I am finger pressing, I am not being heavy-handed with these bias edges. This edge right here is a bias edge. This edge of the blue triangle is a bias edge. This is my straight of the grain. And so as I'm stitching, I want to make sure that I line that up the way it's supposed to be. And see, I have to kind of twist it around until I get it the way I want it. There's the way it lines up. And it will, when you're doing your set, you want to check it before you stitch all 4 of them, because if you get it wrong, you get it wrong 4 times and then you're redoing. So the only thing about I can say about that is if you sew, you also have to learn how to rip out, because you know it happens. So now I have 2 of my triangles on. I have my smaller triangles on. So we're just going to quickly finger press these. If you are worried that they're not going to lay down as nicely as you want them to, you could take them to the iron and press them. If you do take these to the iron and press them, I do caution you to make sure that you're not heavy-handed with your iron, because you can distort these bias edges with your iron. So that's one reason why I just give it a quick little finger press, and I stitch the next triangle on so that I can make it into a rectangle with the bias edges on the inside and straight of the grain all the way around the outside. So there's my 4 center squares and my 2 small triangles. So let's just lay it over here and make sure that we're lined up properly for the remaining triangles. So here's my sample of the one I made before. So at this point, I have my background and my blue triangles on the correct side. This one's actually upside down. It's hard probably to tell on the screen, but it's a little bit darker on the right side. So on this, I again want to sew with the square on top, but I'm going to line up this pointy end with a square. And it doesn't really matter which one you're going to sew through first. I'm going to turn the whole thing this way, and I'm going to actually feed my units through with the pointy end first. Now this is the place where you're going to learn how important a fabric tag or a little bit of fabric to sew off of. Because when you're sewing onto a point or a triangle, this is where, if your machine has a tendency to eat the points, this is where you'd have a problem. So you're just going to line that up, and notice I lifted my presser foot just a little bit to slide that triangle under, and I am lining up along the edge of my larger blue triangle, and I just want to make sure that it's nice and straight. My red square is what I'm guiding from. So again, I'm going to flip this over, line up the pointy ends of my triangles first, and then I'm going to sew off of the first triangle onto the second triangle, and you may want to just lift your presser foot just a bit to get that point under there. Once I get 2 or 3 stitches in, then I'm going to line up all the way across, and I'm holding the seam from the square onto the smaller triangle and the end. If you feel the need to pin, you could. I would pin right about here, and I would pin right about here. If you are needing to, you could also pin down the seam allowance so it would feed through exactly the way you need it to. I am able to make sure that goes under the needle and doesn't flip. But sometimes you have a machine that just wants to grab those corners and seams and flip them. So whatever you need to do in order to make sure that doesn't flip on you. So again, I'm going to line up the pointy ends first. And I'm going to stitch off of the previous triangle onto this triangle. Once it gets 2 or 3 stitches, I'm just going to straighten that up. And I don't pin if I can help it. I just hold on to the seam and the end and stitch on across that. And I've got one more to do. Pointy ends first. Oops, I was about to sew that on wrong side up. Now, I was about to sew to the wrong side of my light blue triangle, and then I would have been unsewing. So I'm holding here and here. And when you get to your presser foot, you just want to make sure that seam doesn't flip on you. I'm going to park my needle. Okay, so we're going to cut these apart. And so we've missed Tony today. She's on a mystery tour. So we haven't heard yet where she actually ended up. She wasn't sure where they were going when they left. So we've got our light blue. That one I'm going to have to unsew because I've got the wrong side up. We're going to save that. I'll do that later. And I can finish these 3 units so you can see how to trim it. And I'm finger pressing. Again, if you feel like you need to press with the iron, you certainly could. I'm just finger pressing it to make sure that my seams are going away from my square. Now I'm going to add my triangle of background. And I'm going to match up the pointy end of my triangles, but I'm going to flip it and I'm actually going to be sewing from the top. Now this triangle gets trimmed away as well, but I am lining up along the square and the small triangle with my larger triangle, and the pointy ends should match up. If they don't match up exactly, I don't worry about it too much because this is going to get trimmed anyway, but that gives me a better chance of having the shape that I need when I'm finished. So again, here's where it's going to actually fall. I'll move out so you can see. I want to basically match up my pointy ends and let this end just fall where it falls, and it's going to hang over the point. If you feel like you need to pin, I would pin the points here like this, fairly close to it. You don't have to be right on it. And then without stretching your smaller triangle, just let it lay down and pin there. And then if you still need to pin, you could pin here at the corner. I'm just going to start stitching right there and line up. The square is the precise size it's going to stay. It's not going to get trimmed, but the triangle will get trimmed. And I've got one more to add because I'm going to take the time to take that other blue triangle out. Flip this and notice I've got everything lined up, and I'm not going to pin because this is my actual usual way of doing this. I feed it through, line up with my square because that's the one that's the right size. And let's just take this one seam out. Let's talk about this. When you have a triangle to take out, this long side of this particular triangle is the bias edge. My straight edges on this bigger triangle is this side and this side. So I want to make sure that I am not pulling or tugging when I'm taking that out. So let me show you the best way to do that. Gotta look around my camera. If you will take your seam ripper and just fracture every 3rd or 4th stitch, I'm not pulling on that bias edge of my pale blue square. I'm just pulling or getting my seam ripper just up underneath the thread of my seam, and just keep working your way across. You don't want to do anything with that long bias edge that could pull that triangle out of shape. You can pull on the thread and get by with it. You just can't pull on the edge of the triangle. And on this particular side, the long side of the pale blue triangle is bias, and the short side of the dark blue triangle is bias. So after I've fractured all those stitches, I can go to the other side and just get up under a stitch, and I can pull that whole line of thread out, and I didn't have to worry about stretching any of my bias edges out of shape. Now that does leave you with little pieces of thread that you're going to want to get out, because if I go ahead and stitch that, I could trap those little pieces of thread in the next seam, and then you're going to be aggravated. You can get them out, but sometimes it's just more trouble than it's worth after you stitch over them. So if you'll just take the time to take them out and then turn that around. So the first thing I want to do is make sure I get it on the correct side. So check your picture or check one of the ones you've already stitched. So this triangle goes on this side, pointy ends match up, and I want to make sure I put the darker side together. The other three units, I've already stitched both triangles. This one, I wanted to show you how to take out that bias edge, take out the stitching without stretching any of the bias edge. So this one would need the second triangle stitched on. I'm not going to take the time to do that, but just to show you. And even when I'm handling this, I'm not tugging on anything. You can carefully handle these without worrying about stretching things out of shape. But where you get into trouble is if I just take my hands and pull on this seam, because I can stretch that completely out of shape where it's no longer a true rectangle. So let's take these, and notice I have not been to the iron yet, but I've got all of the seams sewn on my Bird of Paradise unit. So we're going to take these to the ironing board. I've got one more fabric tag to snip off. So let me check and make sure I don't need to answer a question. I see a lot of hi Pams, good evenings, hello Cliff, Pam, and Tony, but Tony's off having a fun time a few days. So we're going to go over to the overhead camera and we're ready to press. Now again, I'm going to finger press this before I set the iron on it, because that way I can make sure that everything's laying down flat, and I can do a better job of not stretching any of the bias edges out of shape. So all of the triangles have the bias edges on the inside of the rectangle. The outside edges of this rectangle are straight of the grain, which is what I want. So I'm going to set the iron on it, and I just gave it a quick little finger press. I didn't spend a lot of time on it. So there's one of them. I'll leave that back on there and let it heat back up. So I'm going to press all of them. Even if I'm doing 100 of these, I'm going to be finger pressing before I set the iron on it. That's just a really good habit to get yourself into. That helps get your seams all going the correct direction. My iron's not hot yet. We'll just put it back on there and let it heat while I'm finger pressing. So this one, just give it a little finger press. You can even finger press, kind of just smash it down with your hands, then get your acorn pressing pin, and notice I'm going all the way around the square with my acorn pressing pin, because I did not use the acorn pressing pin on any of the seams as I put the square around them. That way, I don't run the risk of distorting during the piecing. Sometimes when you're working with a piece that has some bias edges and some not, you can distort it during the process of pressing it. So you want to be real careful. So now we're ready to trim the, I've got to find my square tool. We're ready to trim our unit. So there's a couple of things we can look for. So remember, this is a 3 by 6 finished unit. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to be looking for. When you're trimming, you're actually going to trim the peak of my mountain first using the square tool. And I'm using the X's over here that say 6. Now, there's also a dashed line down the row between the 6's right there. And I'm going to be putting those dashed lines. I'll put it here where you can see it. There's my dashed line here. There's my dashed line here. And I'm going to put that X that says 6 on the peak, and I'm going to line up those dashes, the dashed lines on my seams. And I'm going to trim up and over. I'm going to turn 180 degrees. Now this time I'm going to put this 6 on the peak. I'm going to find the 3.5-inch line. That's the line right here, and I'm going to line that up here at the base. Now the line doesn't extend all the way over, but if you get the 6X on the peak, you line up on the top of your unit on your seams. If you'll kind of give it a glance, this 6, the bar of this X should point right to the corner. You're also going to have the edge of the line here that's actually a 6.5-inch mark on the edge, and that's going to give you what you need in order to have a 3.5 by 6.5-inch trimmed unit. So that being said, this is what you're going to see on the instructions for the Bird of Paradise unit. And I'm looking for the large square because I want to show you, just in case that's the tool you're using. I again would put the peak at the top. I would line up the number 6X and the number 6 dashed lines on my seams. And once I get that in place, then I can trim up the right side and across the top. That gives me the seam allowance I need here at the tip, and then I'm going to turn 180 degrees. I would find the 3.5-inch line, that's this line right here, and I'd also find the 6 line here, line up on the dashed lines, and once I get that in place, this line should connect all the way across. This line should connect right on that seam, and I'm just going to tweak it a little bit till I get it to look as close as I can. I'm going to trim up and across, and there's my next Bird of Paradise. Now, there's one thing I want to share with you that is not on your technique sheet, but consider this. Since this is the same shape as a flying goose unit, for this particular unit, I can actually use my wing clipper tool to trim it at this point. Where you really have to have the squared tool is on the A part of the tool to make sure that this center square is exactly the size it needs to be for whatever size you're making. But if I am making a 3.5 by 6.5-inch trimmed unit, I can actually use this the lines on my wing clipper tool. I would line up, and it's not necessarily designed like this, but because the lines are all matching the flying goose unit, I don't have Invisigrip or anything on my tool. I can actually trim across as if I'm ignoring this and just treating this whole unit like a flying goose. You would put the valley toward the valleys that the seam formed toward you first, and then trim the peak last. So that is also an option. Okay, so where that comes in handy is, say you own both tools and you've gotten your piecing done, and then it's time to trim, and your square tool, if you're like me, I've laid it somewhere and I can't find it, but I know where my wing clipper tool is. I can actually trim this unit with either one of those tools. You just have to make sure that you're lined up and you reserve your seam allowance at the tip so you're not chopping off that tip when you're going to put the next seam across it. So hopefully that made sense. Did anybody have questions about how I did that? Because on your technique sheet, it's going to tell you to use the squared tool for trimming. And you can, but you can also use the wing clipper tool as well. Not for trimming the center square to size, but for trimming up the whole unit. So then once you get that done, you're ready to build the block. And I want to show you what you have to line up. So first of all, I want to make sure that when I put this on my layout, I have all of the pieces lining up where I want them to be. Now, of course, you don't have to add the pieces in the same order I have. You can play with these, rearrange them. You could create a whole different block just by playing with the arrangement of the pieces. So you don't have to do the same arrangement I did, but I do want to show you, if you're going to place your pieces this way, what you need to match up in order for it to look like this double pinwheel. The small dark blue pinwheel and then a large light blue pinwheel. I'm going to want to line up this seam with this tip. So I'm going to show you how I would do that. We're going to flip this over. First of all, you can change what direction this seam is pressed, if that's helpful. You can even press this seam open. But I'm going to show you how I would put this together if I press toward the small triangle here, if I press toward the triangles here. This is what this would look like. So I'm going to go over to the sewing area so you can see what that would be like. So here again, this is where I want to line up. I want this to be one continuous line across here. So I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to put the, I'm going to find a pin that I can make dark enough that you can see it. I'm going to put the square from my Bird of Paradise on top. There's my seam. I wanted you to be able to see that intersection where the two seams of these larger triangles match. And I'm going to grab a pin and I'm going to insert it right in that intersection. Then I'm going to insert my pin on this piece on the seam, and I want it to be 1/4 of an inch from this top edge. You can measure that, you can eyeball it, but you want it to be 1/4 of an inch. If you get it in the right place, the two rectangles should match up across the top, and they should actually match up on the sides as well. So once you get that in place, I'm going to go just a thread farther. So it'll lay down and it won't be pulling. Once you get that in place, then I'm just going to leave that pin in for a second, grab another pin, and I'm going to glide it in kind of at an angle so that I can have that pin inserted, and I'll take out the placement pin. That just keeps everything all lined up. And now I'm going to stitch across the top, and I want to hit that intersection where I drew the line on so you could see that. And I, of course, would do this 4 times. So I'm going to be stitching right to that intersection. And then once I get past that, then I'm just guiding across here with my 1/4 inch guide and park my needle. And let's see how we did. It should look like a continuous seam all the way across that pale blue fabric. So that's what I'm after. And if you're using a print on this part, you wouldn't even notice this part of the seam. On my color, you do see that, but once you quilt that, you probably would never notice this. Now at this point, I would probably press this seam open, but you could press it to one side, and if you do, it'll need to probably go to the top. But that would create a little bit less bulk. If you're going to press open, then you flip it over, give that a finger press along that seam, and then you're going to actually press with the iron from the back side. Back side if you're pressing open, front side if you're pressing to the side. So that's how you would put that together, and you would do that 4 times to create the 4 units you need for your double pinwheel in the blue Delft mill. I'm thinking blue Delft dishes. That's how you would press that in order to get that together. So any questions that I need to answer before we sign off? So keep in mind that you're always welcome to contact me if you have questions. If you need to watch the video again, you can find it later on YouTube or as well on our Facebook page in the video section. So until next week, happy sewing. Come and see the fabrics that we have to share.